we just talked about documents in Photoshop, arranging documents and moving, zooming in, things like that. Now let's talk about brushes. This is my favorite tool in Photoshop because it's the most versatile tool. I think it's the tool that we use the most because you can use brushes not just to paint, but combining them with different effects and things like that. So you're able to really make the most of your image. And this is why I think this is the most fundamental tool. As we left off, we had a canvas open. So I'm going to close that out. And we have our welcome screen here. As I mentioned the first part, we're going to quit Photoshop so we enable the setting of getting rid of this welcome screen. If you want to keep it there, that's fine. Just go into your settings and make sure that's enabled. So hitting Command Q quits Photoshop or File Quit. Then we'll go back and actually click on Photoshop to relaunch. And there we go. This time we have nothing except Photoshop that's open, no welcome screen, and we can jump straight into it. I'm going to start working by opening up an image. I'll go to File, Open, and I'm going to load a RAW file. However, you can load a JPEG or any other file that you like. This was an image shot for Dixie Dixon's tutorial on swimwear, lingerie, and editorial, available on rggedu.com. At the moment, we're not going to process this RAW file. We'll get into that in the next chapters. So I'll hit Open for now. And if you have a JPEG, it'll already open into Photoshop automatically. The first thing that we want to do with Photoshop itself, since we're working on the brush tool in this tutorial, we'll click on the brush tool, which is right here under the column on the right, the fourth tool down. If you, for instance, can't find it, it's probably consolidated with these arrows. And the same thing goes for these properties. These palettes will collapse and expand just based on these arrows. So in the Tools section, we'll click on Brush. Before actually getting into it, you need to know a few shortcuts. And that by default, the Brush tool is set to B. And if you can't find it, just click on this icon here, and it'll have Pencil, Brush, and so forth. I've changed my shortcut for the time being. However, by default, it is set to B, and I will also show you how to change the shortcuts coming up as well. When you have the shortcut enabled, what it does is you don't have to access the tool menu every single time you want to use a new tool. Like I mentioned before, if you want to zoom in, hold the Z key, and you get to the Zoom tool, hold the space bar, you get to the Move tool. And then, when you want to use the brush, just use your shortcut for the brush. So this gives you a really efficient workflow when you're working in Photoshop and wanting to change between tools. Already you're able to do quite a few things by just being able to look at the basic tools that we're using. Aside from that, there's these two colors here. These are your brush colors. So for instance, the foreground color, which is your primary color, for me is currently set to red. For you, it might be set to another color. For example, black and white, which is what it is by default. If you want to change your colors, all you need to do is click on the box and pick the color you want to change. Or, if you want to change the background color or your secondary color, you can click on that box and pick the color that you want and hit OK. Or you can use these arrow keys, and that will swap the colors. The shortcut command for that is X. If you hit X on your keyboard, it swaps them out, so you can change between the two colors. If you want to go back to default, just hit the D key on your keyboard, and that sets them back to black and white, which is the default colors. Before we begin brushing, I want to talk about your brush size, how to change that, and how to change how soft or hard your brush is. That will dictate how soft your edges are when working on images that have edges, or if you want a really soft effect, or when you're working on skin, or things like that. The place to go in Photoshop is on the top, you'll see a little dot with a number next to it on the top left. But your brush tool has to be active before you access this. So make sure it's highlighted. We'll come down here and you can change your brush size. And you know it's changing because the number changes. And when you bring your cursor back over the screen, it looks different. So if I change to 1400 pixels, it changes the size of your brush to 1400 pixels. What does that mean? Let's go ahead and hit escape that area by just clicking outside of it, and it accepts the change that you've made. And then with the black brush that we have set to default by hitting the D key, make sure that these two settings here, your flow and opacity, are set to 100. And then we'll start brushing. And with one stroke, without releasing my finger off the trackpad or the mouse, you'll notice that it draws on the canvas. How do we undo that? Well, since we mentioned in the preferences with the history states, we can undo something 20 times. So if we do 20 individual brush strokes, we can go back to that specific figure. How do we do that? Well, that's simple. Two ways. Under Window, we can go under History. So now we have a third palette introduced to the mix. This history palette is kind of exactly what you would imagine it to be, which is a history brush. These are the different states of your drawing. So when I go one back, when I go one up the history panel state, it undoes the brush stroke that we just did. So what if we do multiple strokes? You can see the history is building. So if we start undoing and undoing and undoing, we go back to the beginning before we did any brush strokes. Now a quick way of actually going back in your history without having the history palette open is very simple. So I'm going to close that out. I'm going to start brushing on the image itself. Let's say we want to undo this. We can go under Edit, Step Backward. And what that does is automatically it goes back to the last stroke that you did in sequential order. Now if you want to go forward, just go to Edit and Step Forward. And it goes forward. The shortcut for that is located under the menus right next to the actual word. So Step Backward is Shift Command Z, Option Command Z, and then Step Forward is Shift Command Z. And similarly on a PC, you'll find the shortcuts right here as well. So Alt Control Z to go back, Shift Control Z to go forward. So aside from that, there should be an easier way to also change the size of your brush instead of having to go under your menus every single time. And good news, there is. By default, it's the bracket key on your keyboard. When you hit the one on the right, it goes up, and the bracket on the left, or the open bracket, it goes down, which makes it really cool. Another option is if you hold Option, Control, and you click left and right, kind of like your zoom tool. When you went left and right, so you hit Option, Control, left and right, it changes the size of your brush. On Windows, it's Control, Alt, and right click. On Mac, it's Control, Option, click. So when we change our brush size, it changes based on the number we want. This is my favorite because it gives you a visual representation of the brush size, or your bracket key. That's why I never have to really go into my menus again. So we talked about brush size and undoing and redoing. But what about hardness? What is hardness? Well, as you can imagine, it's exactly how it sounds. Under your menu, you have a second column, hardness, and you can change how hard the size of the brush is. And the same thing goes for our shortcut here. Instead of going left and right, when you Option click, or I'm sorry, when you Option Control click, instead of going left and right, just go up and down, and that changes your hardness. Now the next thing we want to talk about very briefly is the different dynamics that your brush has. Under window and brush, temporarily I want you to make sure that your shape dynamics are turned off. This will be a section that I'll be covering primarily when we use the Wacom tablet for those of us who are using it, and for those of you who may also want to know about using it more. One thing that we can do for now is making sure that it's turned off so that everything that we do at the moment is able to be replicated no matter what you're using. So I'll go and minimize that for now by using this collapsing tab as we talked about. Or if we don't need it, we can come down to the drop-down menu and hit Close Tab Group. So now that we've talked about your hardness, your brush shape, and the color that you can use for your brush, we can go further and talk a little bit about your flow and opacity settings. Flow and opacity is something that I feel that everyone should know about because it is the blueprint of retouching or blueprint of working in Photoshop when you're modifying your images. Flow and opacity can be explained very simply. It sounds very complicated, and for most people it is because A, they don't really know much about it aside from the default settings in Photoshop, which is found up top here. When you have your brush enabled, going up to the top menu, you'll see something called opacity, it'll be 100%, and flow, it'll be 100% by default. I want you to make sure that it is. The way to do that is hover your mouse or your pen stylus over opacity and drag the sliders till it's at 100%. The same thing goes for flow. So, simply put, everything we've been doing so far has been with flow of 100 and opacity of 100. In case your results aren't the same, that's probably why. Now you know. So, again, we'll have our brush, we'll set to defaults, and then I'll do one quick sweep across the canvas, back and forth. There we go. You'll notice, as we mentioned, my brush hardness is set to 0% because it's 100%, I should say it's completely soft. So if it's 0%, it's soft. If it's 100%, it's completely hard and has really contrasting edges. However, you notice that when we started brushing, each stroke that we did was absolute. It completely covered the image in the color that we had selected. So for instance, as I'm brushing across this image, you'll see that it covers our subjects with one fell swoop and doesn't leave any transparency. What if we wanted some transparency? I'll change my hardness to 100% for this demonstration. And then I'll increase my brush size of my brackets. Let me drop my opacity down to, say, 10%. Another shortcut for opacity is on your keypad, on your keyboard, you'll see the top row of keys, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so forth. Hitting the 2, for instance, changes to 20% opacity. 3 is 30%, and so forth. If you wanted, say, 46% or a double-digit number, you simply hit the keys in sequential order. So say 45 is 4 and 5 right after each other. We'll keep opacity at 20%. Now when I start brushing without lifting up my cursor, or with one click, you'll notice that there's a layer of transparency. It's not completely black, but you notice that we start actually adding black to the canvas. And we start adding black in a very tiered format. It stacks on top of each other, and it builds. So that's opacity. And the number equates to how rich each click becomes, essentially. So, for example, I have a couple of clicks, and it comes across really fast. And in a few clicks, it covers the canvas quite readily. So let's undo that, as we talked about earlier. Now let's talk about flow. We already know what opacity is. But what about flow? Well, flow is very interesting because by default at 100%, it comes across and adds all of that color immediately. But if I drop my flow down to, say, 10%, which is shift and the number, so shift 2 is 20%, shift 3 is 30%, that means that the moment that I actually click once, it's going to start building on itself when I go over the same area with the same motion. So if I have a flow of 5% and I start going in a circle without lifting my finger off the mouse, it starts building on each other in a very steady format. In a way, you can think of flow very similarly to how fast a car is going. Opacity is like your destination, where 100% means it's going to be eventually filled all the way in one stroke. Flow dictates how fast it's going to be filled. So if I have a flow of 100, the second I click down on my mouse or my stylus, if I'm using a tablet, or my trackpad, it immediately fills completely black. But if I have my flow at 1% and I click down once, I have to go over it again and again and again without lifting up my cursor, and it eventually fills in to 100%, but very slowly because it's at 1%. And the difference being that if I have my opacity really low and I go over the same area again, it doesn't fill that area if it's already being filled at that percentage. I have to I have to re-click again and then start brushing every single stroke again and again till it fills up to 100%. For me personally, I like to control everything by flow, and the reason for that is I don't have to keep clicking again and again to build on itself. It's very smooth and gradual. It's very natural. So that's ultimately the difference between flow and opacity, something that I want you to try and get accustomed to, because once this section's covered, everything from here on out becomes more about the brush and how it's used with flow and opacity as well. Another really cool shortcut is the airbrush setting. Now the airbrush setting is located right next to flow on the right hand side. What the airbrush setting actually does is quite interesting. As we talked about, for example, opacity being 100% and flow being 10%, you'll notice that if I want to build the paint on itself, I have to go over the same area again and again and actually move my cursor as it's being clicked. So as I hold down and I move across the canvas, it only builds as I move. If I stop moving and I still have my cursor held down, it's actually not going to build on itself. However, this is where it all changes. If I have my airbrush setting on and I hold down my cursor once, it's going to start building regardless if I start moving my cursor. And the benefit of that is if you're working in a really tight space, or if you want to build up on a location where you don't want to keep moving left and right so much because it's maybe really tight, or it's something that you want to quickly just build up on itself, the airbrush setting lets you do that. The other advantage of the airbrush setting is actually the shortcut. So if you wanted to change the shortcut for opacity, like I mentioned, you have to hit the number key on your keypad, which changes opacity. When this airbrush setting is on, flow becomes the thing that's most important. So if you hit your keypad now and hit 6 on your keypad, it changes the flow. So if I hit 9, it changes to 90. If I hit 3, it changes to 30. My personal favorite in regards to settings are keeping my hardness set to 0% for most purposes, and if there's any reason not to, I'll actually explain why, and enabling airbrush so that anytime I want to change my flow setting, I just have to hit the keypad. The last shortcut that I want to talk about is something that becomes really handy when you want to make straight lines in a hurry. I'll quickly go ahead and reset everything to 100%, but this time I'll use a very small brush. And let's say that you wanted to make a straight line across the canvas. By hand, it becomes really difficult sometimes to make these quick edges. The quickest way to do that is very simple. All you do is click on your starting point, and then at the end point, hold Shift, and then click again. And as you can see, it connects the dots. So it makes straight lines in any situation that you need to use a brush to make straight lines in. And to undo that, it's Option Command Z, and we go back to default. So now we've included everything you really need to know about brushes. Next thing we're going to go on to is our Wacom tablet settings for those of you who are interested in using a stylus.